Hello, class, and welcome back to Chapter 4. In this section, we are going to discuss brain development. Before we talk about the specifics in brain development, we first have to understand the neuroconstructivist view of brain development. The first view, part of the neuroconstructivist view, is that the brain has plasticity. What plasticity means is that the brain is able to be molded and shaped. Plasticity means that the brain is able to be molded and shaped. Also, the neuroconstructivist view of brain development, they believe that brain development is closely linked with children's cognitive development. And what that means is that as the brain continues to develop, the more that children should be able to do cognitively because their brain is developing. So brain development and children's cognitive development should go hand in hand if there are no disorders or anything like that with the child. Lastly, as a part of the neuroconstructivist view, just like as we talked about during chapter 1, chapter 2, and really just throughout this class, and something that I want you all to just keep in mind, and that is that genes and the environment both influence the brain. Just like with everything else, that all kinds of development, other parts of child development, genes and environment influence those as well. The same goes for the brain. Okay, let's talk about the 4 lobes of the brain. So we are going to start with the back here and talk about the occipital lobe. And when you think about the occipital lobe, that is what controls vision, what allows you to see and to process what you are seeing. The next that we're going to talk about is the parietal lobe, which is up here. And this is very important for spatial location, being able to pay attention. And when we talk about motor control, that means being able to control your bodily functions, being able to walk, being able to run, being able to throw a ball, being able to sit still for a period of time is motor control. All of those are controlled by the parietal lobe of your body. And I'm going to do the temporal lobe next. And the temporal lobe is very important because just like you are understanding and processing my language as I'm speaking to you, and you're also hearing what I am saying now, all of that comes from your temporal lobe. And when you take a quiz, the memory portion of your brain is also controlled by the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe is really what you all are using right now. Think about hearing me speak, processing the language that I'm speaking, which is English, and as you study, you memorize different things so that you'll be able to pass the quiz. So that all of that is controlled by the temporal lobe. And lastly, the frontal lobe, which is the lobe that takes the longest to develop in children, adolescents, adults, the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe really deals with executive functioning and thinking, and also the personality comes from the frontal lobe. So a lot of times you may see people that get into car accidents, for example, and their frontal lobe is damaged, and their family members may describe them as being a different person because that personality, the frontal lobe, which controls the personality, has been damaged, and so their personality is different. Additionally, we with the frontal lobe, also with voluntary movement and being intentional or doing things on purpose. So the frontal lobe and all of the lobes, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, the parietal lobes, all of these are very important to children and adults as they develop and help with day-to-day functions that children have to do. as we're talking about the brain, we have to talk about neurons. And neurons are nerve cells. And the nerve cells are responsible for processing information. Not only do they store information, they transmit information. And something else, how neurons are connected are through synapses. And synapses are gaps between the neurons. And that allows, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide, but the gaps in the between the neurons allow for information to travel. They travel through the synapses until they get to another neuron. How do neurons work? Well, there are certain parts of a neuron that you need to have a good understanding of. So first is the cell. We talked about the cell body when we talked about the different types of body cells. So we talk about the cell body of the neuron, and there's a nucleus, which is pretty much home base, what tells the cells what to do. That occurs in the nucleus. But then you have the axon. And the axon is responsible for sending electronic or electrical signals away from the cell body. So we see the cell body, we see the axon. So if the electrical signals are traveling away from the cell body, which is the job of the axon, then it's going to travel through the myelin sheath, as you can see this arrow here. And the myelin sheath is just another name for fat cells. These fat cells help the information or the electronic or electrical signals to travel faster. So it goes from the body to the axon, and it goes through the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is just fat cells that helps the information travel faster. And then you go to the dendrites, and the dendrites are these end pieces here, and at the end of the dendrites are the terminal buttons. And the terminal buttons release neurotransmitters into the gaps. And another word for gaps is synapses. You may think, what happens when the neurotransmitters go into the synapses or the gaps? When the chemical interactions in the gaps connect axons and dendrites, which allow for information to pass. So there are some interactions that occur between the axons and the dendrites, which allows for information to pass, and then it goes into the synapses until it meets another cell, another neuron, and the information from the first neuron goes to the second neuron's terminal buttons and dendrites, and the process occurs again and again. Brain development occurs rapidly during infancy, and one of the reasons for that is because there are a lot of neurons that are firing, as we learned how neurons fire and how information is passed down. But something that can occur that is not good during infancy is something called shaken baby syndrome. And we are going to see what shaken baby syndrome is. Be warned, this can be kind of scary. It is looking at shaking a baby, but it's a doll, and you're going to see how that affects the brain when you shake the baby.
Crews were called to a home. The baby was taken to the hospital where he later died. Police have been questioning those involved in Levi's care.
As investigators work that case, ProMedica Toledo Hospital is educating the community about child abuse and how quickly it can become deadly. 13 ABC's Amy Montgomery live from Toledo Hospital, where the pediatric team is using new tools to make an impact. Amy? Diane, the last thing anyone wants to see is a little baby end up in the hospital with an injury, especially if it's at the hands of someone else. But doctors say there are ways to prevent that through community resources and education. In an effort to prevent tragedy, the pediatric trauma team at ProMedica is using every tool it can, like this one, an infant human simulator.
And the purpose of this is to show a real visual demonstration of what kind of damage can be within the brain if a baby is violently shaken.
Watching it in action is intense.
So it takes a lot of force. And right now you see that there's lit up. This is where the vision has been affected. There's been some bleeding that could have happened within the back of the brain.
As shaking continues, more lights go off indicating more serious damage has been done.
The baby stopped crying, but now there's damage to the frontal area of the brain, which controls the personality, their emotions, and so forth.
For many parents, it may be hard to comprehend that someone would hurt a child, but it does happen. Right now, Oregon police are investigating the homicide of a 6-month-old baby boy. The coroner says he died of abusive head trauma. And that's why prevention is key, and it starts with understanding the consequences.
We try to just tell them to walk out of the room. If they're frustrated, put the baby in a safe place, in a crib, and then walk away, and then try to check on the baby every 10 minutes or so.
She also suggests parents turn on music, take the baby for a walk, or even a ride in the car to help everyone relax. And she says parents always have to remember.
It gets better. It's the worst from birth until about 3 months, and then it tends to decrease after that, but it does get better.
And ProMedica hopes to use those simulators more and more out in the community and also at the hospital with new parents. As for the case in Oregon, so far, no charges have been filed. Reporting live in Toledo, I'm Amy Montgomery. Now back to you.
Amy.
Yes, the shaken baby syndrome it can be very scary, and as you can see, it's very damaging to the infant's brain as the brain is still developing rapidly. And so what we talked about with shaken baby syndrome is that the brain swells and hemorrhaging, which meaning that the brain can start to bleed. And that actually affects about hundreds of babies in the US each year. And what has been shown throughout research is that usually males are the perpetrators of shaken baby syndrome. So it's something to keep in mind that, you want to protect the baby's brain at all costs during infancy. So it's very important to be gentle with babies.
Crews were called to a home. The baby was taken.
Brain development during childhood, there are some differences. Between the ages of 3 to 6, the most rapid growth is in the frontal lobes. And when we talk about the frontal lobes, she talked about in the video, she talked about how that deals with emotion and how that also deals with being able to have executive functioning, such as maintaining attention and organizing new actions. But when we're talking about age 6 to puberty, the most dramatic growth is in the temporal and the parietal lobes. And the temporal and the parietal lobes, as we talked about, that deals with spatial skills and it deals with understanding language. Lastly, we're going to talk about brain development in adolescence. When we are talking about adolescence, a lot of times we are talking about the lack of development of the prefrontal cortex. Even though there are advances in the development of the prefrontal cortex of adolescents, it is still not fully developed. Here's a question for you. Do you know when the prefrontal cortex reaches maturity? I'll give you a hint. It's after adolescence. Give up? The prefrontal cortex reaches maturity around the age of 25 to 26. And I don't know if you all know, but that directly corresponds to when you are able to rent a car, which is around the age of 25 or 26, because they understand that the prefrontal cortex is fully developed at that time. And it takes a while. Like I said, it starts from birth, but it doesn't end until around 25 or 26. Okay, see you on the next video.